with the American Enterprise Institute. He's written a new book titled Dancing with the Devil, The Perils of Engaging Rogue Regimes. Michael, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Tim and Ed. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I think, and this is a little bit of whiplash here for our listeners, going from culture war to rogue regimes. So the first thing I'd like to ask you to do is define for our listeners and those watching online, what is a rogue regime? Sounds like something that you'd buy some cream for or something if you got a rash. What's a rogue regime?
Oh, if only we could do away with them with some sort of cream. Basically, what a rogue regime is, it's not an enemy. It's not a traditional enemy. It's a much more specific subcategory. The Clinton administration defined it as a regime which is immune to traditional deterrence, which doesn't abide by the norms of diplomacy, doesn't accept diplomacy, and also often engages in terrorism or nuclear proliferation. So, I mean, what should come to mind right away are states like North Korea and the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Okay, so for people who, like my age, I'm 55, who grew up during the Cold War, you knew who your enemies were. The Soviet Union was, and its satellites, the Warsaw Pact and NATO against the United States. We had that doctrine, mutually assured destruction. You were pretty sure that the Soviet Union didn't want to, be blown into oblivion in a nuclear exchange. We didn't. So you had at least some sort of rational basis upon which to have negotiations or build a foreign policy. You're saying these groups like Iran and North Korea, you can't deal with them in that way. Is that correct?
That's correct. In the same way, when it comes to Iran, for example, we can sit down with Iranian diplomats and talk. But let's remember, it's not the diplomats that control the nuclear program in Iran. It's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, this highly ideological religious army that has said that they don't care what the diplomats do. They're not going to give up their quest for nuclear weapons. And so we need to deal with the reality of the situation rather than simply accept this notion, which President Obama has put forward, that it never hurts to talk.
Yeah, I remember that during the couple of the debates with John McCain in 2008. President Obama basically said his foreign policy would shift from the Bush administration. They had the axis of evil. He said, I'll talk with anyone. And that sounds very reasonable. So what is wrong with that? Is it just simply that you're not always dealing with the people who make decisions?
Well, that's part of it. But look, I have nothing against talk and I have nothing against diplomacy. I would argue that the way President Obama sees it, however, is woefully naive. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, when she was still Secretary of State, had said, hey, look, if you're not going to talk to your enemies, who are you going to talk with? And that's absolutely true. But when Ronald Reagan, for example, sat down with Mikhail Gorbachev, the chairman of the Soviet Union, he did that only years after a military buildup, so that he could set the right circumstances and talk from a position of strength. Unfortunately, in this administration, leverage seems to be a dirty word.
Talking to Michael Rubin, Dancing with the Devil is the title of his book, The Perils of Engaging Rogue Regimes. What did you think about, I kind of found myself agreeing with President Obama, which would be the third time in 5 years. I agreed with him on Happy New Year, which he wished everybody. No, I'm just kidding. That I do on rare occasion agree with him on things. But he basically told the Karzai, is that the fellow's name over there in Afghanistan?
In Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai.
He told him, listen, you're going to play by our rules or we're out of here. And by the end of the year, this is just me speaking. I don't speak for anybody or any group. I just question the whole point of being there anymore in Afghanistan. I think that's where the majority of American people are. But anyway, what did you think about the Afghanistan situation?
Well, I have no problem with the decision to go into Afghanistan and go into Iraq. What I have a problem with are the billions of dollars in years spent on nation building. I'm basically throwing billions of dollars, thousands of American lives down the drain for a job which fundamentally isn't that of the U.S. Army. The job of the U.S. Army should be to protect U.S. national security, and this notion that we can simply throw money at the problem and these states will rise up and accept that money without corruption, without terrorism, is simply wrong.
So you're saying we try to buy them off?
Well, what I'm saying is all too often we try to do things through aid, which can't be done. What I'm saying is the job of the U.S. military should be to protect national security,
not stay forever,
not to build wells and schools.
Not to, well, you know, I agree with that, and a lot of, you know, when you say change hearts and minds, you know, for the military, I'm going, what are we, the Red Cross? I mean,
Yeah.
I understand you want to build relationships to help your objective if you're the military, and you have to work with some unsavory characters at times. But I mean, this idea of staying decades in places and, like you said, nation building, I think the American people maybe, I don't think you'll see any president or any Congress wanting to do that again.
Anytime soon.
Tim and Ed, if I could just say one thing about the military, one of the things that astounded me when I researched this book, and what it really is it's a history of a half century of American diplomacy with both rogue regimes and terrorist groups. What I found is that I spend about a third of my time with the military. I'm often down in the South, either at Fort Polk or at Camp Shelby in Mississippi, doing training for our folks deploying overseas. And what astounded me is that our men and women in uniform spend more time in the classroom going over their mistakes to make themselves better sailors, soldiers, and pilots than they do actually in the field. And never once in the last half century, however, has the State Department conducted a lessons learned exercise to identify their mistakes and to try to learn from them. Albert Einstein had a quip that the definition of insanity is doing the same action repeatedly, but expecting different results each time. By that definition, it's time that our Secretary of State see a shrink.
Michael Rubin is our guest. His book is called Dancing with the Devil, The Perils of Engaging Rogue Regimes. So Iran, you talked about them a little bit earlier. By the way, do you think we'll have that the military probably will be out of Afghanistan by the end of the year?
If not by the end of the year, soon after.
Do you agree with that?
That's my prediction as an analyst. I'm by training, I'm a historian, so I get paid to predict the past, and I only usually get that right about half the time. But if I had to put my bets on the table, I'd say early next year.
Okay.
That's a good line. I like that.
Absolutely. Sound like a country song title there. Only predict the past and only get it right half the time. The Iranian situation, I've thought that even back to the Bush years, that there was very little we could do. I mean, we had the sanctions going on, but very little we could do to stop Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. Maybe you disagree with that. Short of military intervention, which I don't even know if it would work, A.
Right.
Number two, it would be a big loser with the American people.
Yeah.
Because of
After a decade of war.
Yeah, we don't want any more. What do you think about the situation with Iran? Do you think they're going to have a nuclear weapon?
Yeah,
or
what do we do then?
Or do they already?
Well, Tim and Ed, I don't think they have it already, although they're getting pretty close to having the capability. As you know, I used to live in the Islamic Republic of Iran. I spent several months there. It's what happens when you grow up in a family of veterinarians and you're allergic to dogs and cats. You end up in a place like Iran. They actually used to call me, in Persian, Pesari Shaitani Bozorg, which means son of the great Satan, because, of course, they call the United States the great Satan.
Right.
At any rate, the important thing to remember with regard to Iran, and this is also a theme of the book, that they have a very different perspective, the people we're negotiating. We're drilled in our schools and in the military in multiculturalism about appreciating each other's differences, but multiculturalism doesn't simply mean walking into a sushi restaurant, a Japanese sushi restaurant, and ordering a mojito. Ultimately, we need to recognize that different people think in different ways. We do have the power to pressure Iran not to build a nuke. In the year before President Obama started his negotiations, the Iranian Bureau of Statistics had said that the Iranian economy had shrank 5.4%. That's quite a recession. But what did President Obama do? Just to get to the table, let alone come to a deal, but just to come to the table, he gave them between $7 and $20 billion in sanctions relief and new investment. That's like giving a 5-year-old dessert first and then asking him to eat his vegetables later. It's simply not going to happen. Our strategy is upside down. You know, when I lived in Iran, they used to have a quip that they play chess while Americans play checkers. Unfortunately, it seems the White House right now is playing solitaire.
You think President Obama's just trying to run the clock out on his administration's dealings with Iran? In other words, get this 2.5 years, or when is it? 3 years from now?
Just under 3 years. Yeah.
3 years from now, be done with this, be somebody else's problem.
I think two things are going on. First of all, I think Iran is trying to run the clock down. And what scares me, I read Farsi, which is the language they speak in Iran. And the Iranian nuclear negotiators might tell us one thing in English, but in Farsi, when they're writing to each other, they're looking at North Korea as the model, not a model to emulate, not a model to condemn. President Obama, it's either naivete in the White House about the way the rest of the world works, and he sees international relations as coming to a compromise. People like the supreme leader in Iran or Vladimir Putin in Russia see international relations as a zero-sum game in which they win and the United States loses. At the same time, I've come to conclude that the biggest difference between the left and the right when it comes to national security is the left tends always to demonize power, whereas the right sees that power can be used for either good or bad.
So bottom line, well, I don't know if we can ever get to a bottom line in Iran, but is there anything President Obama to do at this point to stop? I don't think we can stop him. But maybe you disagree with that.
Well, historically, the Iranians have staked out a policy, said they were never going to compromise, and then didn't about face 2 times. The first was with what it would take to release the American hostages under Jimmy Carter. And the second was what it would take to end the Iran-Iraq war, that horrendous war that occurred in the 1980s. Well, a lot of diplomats, and Jimmy Carter said it was the persistence of diplomacy that won the release of our hostages. That's nonsense. Iraq had invaded Iran, so the price of Iran's isolation got to be too great to bear. With regard to what it would take to end the Iran-Iraq war, Iraq had invaded Iran. The Iranians had more or less pushed the Iraqis back by 1982, but rather than take a ceasefire, Ayatollah Khomeini said, hey, look, we're going to push through until we liberate Jerusalem. And there followed 6 years of stalemate, and 500,000 more people died. And then he got on the radio and said, it's like drinking a chalice of poison, but this has become so expensive that I have no choice but to drink from it if our country's to survive. The question for President Obama, if he wants Iran to give up its nukes, is has he increased the isolation to be to that same degree, and is he forcing the supreme leader of Iran to drink from a chalice of poison? I don't know, but I can guarantee giving $20 billion in sanctions relief isn't it.
Well, we mentioned, and we just have just a couple of minutes left, really just kind of a minute and a half. So this is a little bit unfair. But tell us, what does America do with Kim Jong-un, this seeming nutcase in North Korea?
Well, ultimately, in the past, when we've stood up to the North Korean leaders, they've actually backed down. There was the famous case in 1976 of Operation Paul Bunyan when we wanted to chop down a tree, and in order to get it done, we sent a carrier strike group. But too often, and I'll conclude with this, we end up whitewashing these rogue rulers in order to try to pretend that our diplomacy is working. What I found in my book, Dancing with the Devil, is if you want to see whether the rogue really has changed, one of the best indicators is actually their respect for religious freedom and religious liberty. If they're still imprisoning and killing Christians in Iran and North Korea, you can bet they're not really changing their personality at the negotiating table, no matter what the White House wants you to believe.
I tell you where you win the war on terror in Afghanistan, that is build cell phone towers all over the country and distribute cell phones to every one of them. And they'll be sitting there looking at that playing games instead of plotting terrorist activities.
Maybe.
Yeah, Yeah, that's
Laugh.
what
Go
we
ahead
do.
and laugh.
That's what we do.
That's what I'm saying. Go outside and watch Americans. They're
Yeah.
addicted to these things, and you just I'm telling you, it'd be a lot less expensive.
Give them a free Netflix account.
Yeah, hey, there you go. Have them on the couch.
Michael, I'm not sure I've heard
Thank you.
a smarter person on foreign policy. This has been a great discussion.
Hey, thank you. Anytime.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Michael. Michael Rubin.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye. Joining us.